Okay. Thank you so much for taking time to talk with me today and for sharing your story with the state chapter as part of the 2021 Centennial celebration of our professional organization. And although I'm sure you don't need an introduction, this is Dr. Utzman, who joined the PT faculty in 1995 and has been an integral member of that program since that time, and has also been an active member and leader of our state organization for at least that long. So Ralph, to start, just tell us your involvement with the WVPTA over the years.
Okay, well, I joined as a student, so I've been a member for 34 years when I did the math. That sounds like a long time.
It goes by amazingly fast.
Similar to now, it was expected that we would become members as students, and we did, and got involved right away after graduation. The chapter had meetings a couple of times a year, and they seemed to rotate around the state. So my first state meeting was in the spring of 1990, and it was at Canaan Valley. And the topic was treatment of diabetic foot ulcers. And I remember the weather was awful, and I'd never been to Canaan Valley before. And me and my fiance were driving up there in a blinding snowstorm, literally had our heads out the window a couple of times looking for the lines on the road, and finally made it. And I was shocked how many people had made the trip in that horrible weather on that Friday evening. At that time, Mary Beth Mandich was our education chair, so she had planned the conference and everything. And that's sort of where I started getting involved, is she kind of recruited me to be on the education committee. So, you know, that's how it happens. You come to a meeting and somebody asks you for help, and there you go. So that's how I first got involved with the chapter. So from there, I served on the education committee for a few years and became the chair of that committee in 1994. So we had, during that time, really tried to focus on, okay, we're going to have one big meeting a year, and what's the best approach to get people to come to that? Because it's always a challenge in a state like ours to get people to travel, you know, when everybody's sort of around the border geographically. So that's been a long-standing challenge that I don't think we've solved. But that was something we struggled with back then. And so we started having our annual conference at Flatwoods because it was centrally located, and that way everybody could kind of come to the middle. So we had several conferences. I think it was the Days Inn back then was the name of the hotel. I've spent a lot of weekends in the Days Inn in Flatwoods over the years.
So what have been some of your, I know you've had various roles, so I've been involved with the state chapter for 10 years, and in my time, I've always admired the different roles that you've taken on and the way you've taken those on. So what have been some of the roles that you've taken on since that early time?
So, like I said, I got really involved in the education committee and planned a few conferences. And from there, being on the board of directors, I was at a board of directors meeting, and back then our bylaws said that the chief delegate was the president of the chapter, and the delegate that went with the chief delegate was elected. And so the person who had been elected that year couldn't go. And so they were looking for somebody to go, and the board was going to appoint a delegate to go. And so I volunteered to do that. So that's how I got started with being a delegate in the House of Delegates, is I just kind of raised my hand and say, that sounds like fun, I'll try that. And
I think you've done it a time or two since then, if I'm correct.
I've done it a couple times. And that was really eye-opening for me because I had never been to a national conference. You know, I'd been around, you know, part of the state chapter for a few years, but I had never been to a national conference. So I flew to Orlando. The president at the time was Mike Lamoth, who I knew a little bit from the state meetings and things. but I'd never traveled with him before, so that was kind of fun getting to know Mike. But I just remember walking into the house, you know, the ballroom where the house is held, being, oh my gosh, this is huge. You know, it was such a big deal. And then all these people, all of these names that you read in the journals, and, you know, they're all there, and they're, you know, they're talking to you. It was just really overwhelming, and fun and exciting. So I got to do some programming, because your conference registration was, I forget if it was paid for or at a discount if you were a delegate. But the conference was happening concurrently, and it, in true APTA fashion, it was an exhausting, exciting, you know, few days in Orlando. And it was, you know, I left thinking, oh my gosh, I didn't do half of what I could have done. There's so much here to do. And so I was really hooked from there on, you know, on the House of Delegates and the APTA and everything. It was just such an eye-opening experience. So, it was there that I met Dave Pariser, who some others in the chapter might know. When we went in the first day, Mike and I went in and we found where we were on the seating chart, and they kind of rotate the chapters around, so the same chapters aren't in the front every year, so you kind of move around from year to year. Well, that year West Virginia happened to be in the back, so we had our little placard and our little table stand, and we're looking for our table, and we sit down, and this guy turns around and he sees our placard and he says, oh my gosh, it's West Virginia. Hi, I'm Dave Pariser. Who was a member of our chapter back in the 80s, and was on staff here at WVU hospitals. And then from here went to LSU. And at the time he was representing, I think he was the president and chief delegate of the Louisiana chapter. But it's, again, you go to these conferences and you meet people who are from West Virginia, and it's just like suddenly you're family and you've known each other for years. And so that was another positive experience of being part of that year. So
very nice. Yes. So
from there, I served as delegate and was elected for the next few years. One of the issues with the way our bylaws were written is that the chapter president was also the chief delegate. And both of those roles were getting more and more involved, and there was more and more to do for each of those roles. And so Mike recognized that, okay, I can't do all the president stuff and all of the chief delegate stuff. So for the next couple of years, he was having me act as chief. So he could go to the president meetings and somebody could go to the chief meetings, so that, you know, we would both know what was going on. So that's how I got into the role of chief delegate. And then we changed the bylaws so that we separated those two roles, because him and the next president both said, whoa, this is too much. So that's how that happened.
I was having that same thought as you described that, because with my time in the chapter, they've always been separate roles. So I thought at some point somebody must have recognized that was getting to be too much.
Michael McLeod was like, this is too much. So from there, I was elected to 2 terms as vice president. So I served as vice president from 99 to 2003. Around 2001, at the beginning of my second term, I also started my PhD. And shortly after that, the president of the chapter was injured and was out on medical leave for over a year. So for that year, even though I was vice president, I was acting in her place for many things, because she wasn't able to travel and wasn't working and that kind of stuff. So that last year as vice president was a little overwhelming.
As you started your PhD, yes.
Yeah. So,
isn't that how it goes? Yeah.
So then when my term as vice president was over and we were working on fixing some of the bylaws, and we had put through some bylaws changes to try to modernize our bylaws a little bit, then I stayed on as the bylaws chair for several years. And then was elected again later on to be in the House of Delegates for a couple of terms. So that's kind of in a nutshell, kind of my involvement, my different roles.
what have been some of your biggest challenges or maybe successes in your time with the state chapter?
Okay. So just during the time that I've been involved, and you might have heard this from other speakers, but I think in the 90s there was a little bit of a coming of age for the chapter in a lot of ways. I remember when I was a student, we were in danger of losing the chapter. So I don't know if other speakers have spoken about that or not, but it was really difficult to get people involved and to go to meetings and to get a meeting forum and those sorts of things. And so it seemed like, Sandy and Jane Pertko and Mary Beth and some of the other folks that were really involved at the time were really instrumental in keeping it going and, providing a foundation. And then in the 90s, when I started getting involved, it seemed like we had an influx of therapists that were either moving here from other places, or maybe they'd gone elsewhere to PT school and come back. So people like Mick Bates came here, and came here obviously from out of state, from out of the country to practice. Mike McLeod and several others. Eric Shaw is a West Virginian who went to school elsewhere and came back. So we had kind of an influx of folks coming into the chapter, which was a good thing. And we had some legislative challenges in the early 90s where other groups sort of saw holes in our Practice Act that they chose or looked to exploit. So Eric Tarr tells a good story about that, and Eric Shaw. We realized that we needed to up our game as far as legislative affairs and those sorts of things. So we brought in Nancy Tonkin and Tonkin Management Group as our leadership and lobbying group, which I think was a huge benefit to the chapter to have somebody at that level kind of help us move things along. So it was exciting to be involved in that. I wasn't the one who hired Nancy, but it was kind of going through that process of, okay, well, who are we looking for? What do we need? And that was a huge, I think, win for the association, is kind of recognizing we're all full-time clinicians and we're volunteers. We need somebody dedicated to do this, to help us move this association. So I think that was a huge success. So we started bringing in some national speakers, and that's a trend that continues today. I think we've had a lot of success over the last 20 years or so in bringing in some big names from other places. So we've had Sue Whitney come a couple of times and do programs on vestibular and balance. There was an interest when I was the chair that they wanted to bring somebody in to talk about outcomes and quality management, because all of that was just starting to take off. So we brought in Ed Dobzikowski from Chicago, who did a big program on outcomes and quality management. So we've really seen, I think, kind of our conference grow from just kind of a gathering of friends to, kind of a real true conference, which is exciting to see what it's grown into today. With the conferences we have with the exhibits and multiple speakers and the poster sessions and all those things, it's a real conference. And that's really exciting to see how it's grown from the early 90s to now to be such a big event.
That's interesting for me to hear, because from my time of involvement of about 10 years ago, that's how it's always been. So it's interesting to hear the story. And others who we've interviewed over this time and this celebration have said similar things, that it's grown from kind of a social gathering to one of more kind of academic rigor or educational sharing of information. Yeah.
And the committee's done a good job of keeping that kind of social gathering thing too, because I think that's part of the attraction is, you get together with people that you don't get to see every day. And, so having the evening social things and those sorts of things has kind of kept that part of it, which is very West Virginia, that I think, we don't want to lose, but we've also pulled in the kind of the rigor and the, national presence too. So it's exciting to see how that's grown. I think our payer relations has grown a lot too, and that's I think largely due to Sally Oxley's involvement. But having a couple of payer forums, and we've had those usually every year or every other year for a long time, and that's another area that I think I've seen a huge amount of growth in over the years. I had gone to a national payer forum when I was vice president. Again, it was one of those things, they invited each chapter to send somebody. And so I went to that and I was like, oh my gosh, there's all this stuff we should be doing. And it was, not long after that Sally got involved. I think at that point she was on the Federation of State Boards, because she was the chair of our licensing board for a while. So I think when that, ended, I may be misremembering that, but then she got more involved in the chapter and really took over the payment and payer relations committee and has really grown that into something spectacular too. So
absolutely. Very good. So without a doubt, your experience, your passion about professional involvement as a physical therapist comes through. So to new students, new clinicians, what would be some things that you would pass on to them to help them kind of have that same passion for professional involvement and growth?
So, well, I say this a lot, and it's kind of served me well, is, look for the open doors. You don't always have to walk through, but really think about it. And I've walked through a lot of doors that I wasn't expecting to open, but then there it was, and it's really enriched, my career and my enjoyment of my career over the years. And you've got to be involved to be there when the door opens. So, just paying your dues and being a member, sure, that's nice, but you're not going to get nearly as much out of it that way as if you come to the meetings and volunteer to do things. And it doesn't mean you have to run for office necessarily and commit to something like that right away. Just agree to serve on a committee, or make a few phone calls, or reach out to people depending on what that committee's need is. That many hands make light work. If there's more people involved in a committee, then you can get more done, and we can accomplish more. So that's probably the thing I would say to new professionals is, don't just pay your dues. You got to show up. You got to get involved and kind of, be ready, because we're going to need you. So.
Yes. And starting on that committee, you'll be surprised where that leads. Yep. Yes. All right. So then just to kind of finish up, just feel free to share with us anything else about your time with the state chapter, about your time as a physical therapist that you think would be nice for the rest of the state chapter to hear.
Let's see. Well, I've already said, I think, the thing that I wanted to say about kind of the social aspect and kind of the family feel, even though, we've grown a lot now with 3 schools instead of 2, and the addition of the PTA programs and the growth of the PTA within the chapter. I think we've kept our family feel, which I think is really important, and very Appalachian. So I think that's a good thing.
I love it. And it's if my Take Me Home Country Road sign was purposely placed here right behind me. No, I love that. And that gives me chills. And I think that's one of all of our favorite parts about West Virginia.
I know that there are other opportunities at the national level to get involved. And certainly, many of us at the chapter level have done that. And so I think, being the education chair for the state chapter prepared me for some roles in other components. So I was the education chair for the HPA section for several years, and I wouldn't have felt ready for that. I wouldn't have felt prepared to do that if it hadn't been for my involvement with the chapter.
That's a great point.
But then when that role was over, I was ready to come back home and be more involved with the chapter again. So there's that home and family piece again. So it's, no matter how far you roam, there's always home here.
Well, thank you so much for taking time to talk with us today, Ralph. And I know, and we all hope that your